Thank you, Padmaja. Hi, Peter.
Hello. Just tell me when to start.
Are we on?
I'm on. Should I go?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Sorry for that little hiccup here going around the world. Coming to you from Colorado. My job today is to reset the conversation. There's a lot of discussion in the United States about our future in the world. There's a lot of discussion in India about its future as a major power. But we're all working from an understanding that is now 30 to 40 years out of date. So allow me to kind of reset the picture. At the end of World War II, the Americans created a new age, a new order, the first order of the world. In it, we told everyone that we would use our navies to patrol the global oceans so that everyone could go anywhere at any time, interact with any partner, participate in any supply system, bring any commodity home to produce any product, then send it out for export. For the first time in history, you didn't have to do any of that with a military escort because the Americans took care of it. And that ended the imperial age and brought us globalization and free trade. It worked because it allowed the global system to develop as a containment strategy. We basically created this order. We paid everyone to be on our side. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And the Americans have been edging away from that system ever since. And without that security parameter of the Soviet foe, the Americans lost interest in maintaining the free trade order. Now, let's assume for the moment that the Americans decide that they want to carry this forward into the future. Well, maintaining a global system, maintaining a global order requires three things. First of all, it requires a political culture that is interested in that system. Now, I would argue that the Americans lost that political culture long before Trump became president in 2016. But with the storming of the Capitol complex this January 6th, the US doesn't even have a political culture right now. So until the Americans can knit their culture back together, the Americans are simply incapable of having a foreign policy that's more than perfunctory. Now let's assume for the moment that President Joe Biden is the guy, and that he can do this. He can get us all back on the same side and lead us out into the world. How long do you think that's going to take him? A month? His whole term? More time than he has? You know, this is a decade-long cultural transformation. We're done, at least for now. The second thing that you would need is a global military footprint to enforce the peace, to patrol the global waterways. This is total American troops stationed abroad since World War II. It's been trending down for decades. That ship has sailed, literally. Americans haven't simply decided to leave. Americans have already left. The security underpinnings of the global order are already gone. And what is left is simply running on inertia. And the third thing that you would need to maintain a global system is global economic interests. And Americans have never had that. We have a continental economy, and if we had invested that economy into the wider world, then the global order would not have been a bribe. We would have just been another empire. Now, check out India. India never joined the global order. And so it never gained full access to the advantages of the order in capital, in industry, in technology. Economically, it is this decision not to join the global system that is the root of India's development lag. It was a choice. And culturally, it is this decision not to join the global order that is the root of Indians' inferiority complex, because everyone that Indians compare themselves to did join the order. But the order is now collapsing. And anyone who adapted themselves to benefit, for example, China, now has a lot to lose. But India? Sure. In India not joining, India lost an opportunity to rise. But in not joining, India is not condemned to fall with the rest. So that's our first big point. The structural issues that created the world that we understand, they're gone. And for India, that's fine, because India never joined that world. Next up, let's talk demographics. Now, what we've got here is a standard demographic profile. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Mexico, and this is what we call a consumption-led system. Because anytime you have a lot of people below roughly age 40, it's all about the spending on kids, on cars, on homes, on higher education. It's what drives a modern system. Now, when American political and business leaders look at a demography like Mexico, we really like what we see. All those young people are relatively new into the workforce. They're relatively low value add. So that Mexicans excel at low and mid-skilled manufacturing and assembly. That's not what Americans do. Americans do the high end. We do the design. So the propensity for integration of these systems is huge. Second, all those young Mexicans consume a lot of products. So Mexico became America's largest trading partner in calendar year 2019, and it's a position they're going to maintain for pretty much the rest of our lives. This is a partner. This is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 40 years ago that they never recovered from. So they now have a lot of people in their 50s. Now, those folks have been at their jobs for literally decades, very skilled, very high value added, and going head to head with the American workforce. In addition, not a lot of Koreans in their 20s and 30s. So the Koreans have to export all that product. America will never have a trade surplus with the Koreans. Now, between approximately 1980 and 2015, the world was kind of in this beautiful demographic moment. All of the world's economies were either consumption or export led. Here's a number of them in the year 2000. More or less a perfect balance. But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older, and the picture's changed. The global demographic of high consumption has peaked, and it only can go down from here. As to the export-led economies, they're aging into mass retirement. The year 2022 is the year that most of the advanced world shifts into kind of a post-growth system. Now, in the United States, Americans are kind of a partial exception. And the generation that matters the most are our baby boomers. Now, by some measures, the American baby boomer cadre is just like the baby boomer cadre everywhere else. World War II happened, the soldiers came home, they got married, they built lives for themselves, they had lots of children. Those children are the baby boomers. And there is a boomer cadre in Japan, in the United States, in China, in Germany, in the UK, pretty much throughout the world. Anyone who participated in the war in mass. Now, as you age, the way you invest evolves. So when you're 35, you invest a very small sliver of a very small income for the future. When you're 55, you invest a much larger wedge of a much larger income. And then when you're 64 3/4, every spare cent that you have, you put away for the future. So you would generate more and more capital at a higher and higher velocity. And as you near retirement, you become a little desperate to get that last little bit of income. So you start putting this huge amount of money into projects that when you were younger might not have made sense. So municipal bonds give way to foreign bonds, give way to foreign stocks. American investments give way to European investments, give way to Indian investments. The capital inflow from the world's boomer cadre is the single largest reason for India's growth surge for the past decade. And it's almost over, because in calendar year 2022, the majority of the world's baby boomers, Americans included, move into mass retirement. And when that happens, all of those far-reaching investments get liquidated. And it goes back into the most secure investments you can have, such as American government treasury bills and even cash. Because once you retire, you never add to your stack of investments. So the whole world right now is in its biggest capital glut ever. And it's over next year. In that, American boomers are just like everybody else. But American boomers did one thing that no one else did. They had kids. And the American millennials are unique in that they're really the only ones out there. There aren't Japanese or German or Italian millennials. So they are providing the ballast for our consumption system today, and they will be investing tomorrow. But for the rest of the world, it's a very different picture. Let me give you an idea of the scale. What I've done here is I've stacked up the consumption-led economies in the world today. This is all of them. And this is what they'll look, assuming 0% economic growth, which I realize is not realistic, but we've got to start somewhere. Here's where they will be in 2030. Here's the world's the world's export-led systems. They're aging out. They disappear as a class. Now, today, we only have one post-growth economy. That's Japan. They've already aged into mass retirement. But if you fast forward 10 years and look at the demographics, like folks, this is already over. Consumption has already peaked. Production is peaking right now. Global capital supplies peak this year. None of them will return in our lifetime. You want to grow some more 40-year-olds? It takes 40 years. And all of this was before coronavirus. Coronavirus has driven all the consumption-led systems offline and into recession at the same time. So if you're an exporting nation, it really doesn't matter if you can beat the virus because you have no one to sell to. Let's look at the comparison that everyone in India loves to make. Now here we've got India and China in the year 2000. But as we all know, the Chinese have a one-child policy, so you fast forward that today, and China has now the world's fastest aging demography. Best case scenario, assuming nothing else goes wrong, in the year 2100, there'll be fewer than half as many Chinese as there are today. In calendar year 2020, the Chinese birth rate collapsed, dropped by almost a quarter. And remember, it takes 9 months to have a kid. That means the birth rate in 2020 reflected 2019 conditions. They haven't had their coronavirus crash yet. Now look at India today. It's aging too. India might be resistant to deglobalization, but it's urbanized right alongside everyone else. India's birth rate began to contract 25 years ago, and that contraction sharply accelerated a decade ago. That means India in 2021 is aging at a similar rate to what China aged at back in 1980. That would suggest, in the worst case scenario, India still has 40 years of demographic dividends to reap. That's great. So that's our second big point. India faces little of the demographic pressure that plagues not just China, but most of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no clouds in these silver linings. India has the world's worst sex imbalance. In 2030, there will be 50 million surplus men under 45, concentrated in the Hindu belt. That is a social and a political stability issue. If Indian women today think that there's issues in Indian gender relations now, I mean, look out. In consumption-based systems, having half your population exist is, in essence, a lower caste, has implications for technological progress, investment capacity, and, of course, consumption. Let me put that into a little bit more context. On the left, we are looking at population density. On the right, we're looking at per capita income. So on the left, the red and the orange are the particularly densely populated regions, while blue and green are less dense. On the right, the red and orange are the poorer regions, while the blue and green are the wealthier ones in per capita terms. There's a moderately strong correlation between population density and personal economic performance, particularly in the Hindu belt. Now, I'm not telling you anything that you haven't heard before here. For India, this contest between population and prosperity has always been an issue. My point is that in a world in which global capital supplies are about to collapse, this disconnect is going to sharpen. It will not go away. But at least it's a problem that is a familiar one. It isn't like India is going to be struggling with the collapse of a trade-based model or a consumption-based model or an export-based model or a capital-intensive model. The problems India will have are the problems India already knows. You have methods for dealing with them. They're not perfect, but at least your basic understanding of your domestic economy is not going to change. It's the devil you know. The devil China knows is a disaster. I can give a presentation for 3 hours about how China is going to be a failed state and not exist in a decade, but this is really the one that matters the most. It's the islands off the coast, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. The Chinese call it the first island chain. And there is no period in the long history of the Han people in which China has been able to economically interact with the lands beyond the chain ever, except right now, under the American-led order. Because the basic tenet of the order is that the Americans force everyone to be on the same side and no one interferes with anyone else's economic trade. If the Americans leave, that ends. China is only successful because the Americans are enabling it to be. But the Americans are getting out of that business. Now, there are two countries that theoretically could take America's place and enable China's future success, and they are Japan and India. What we've got here is a map that shows all the energy flows that go into China. Now, 80% of China's oil is imported. 85% of that flows by India. Now, Japan's Navy is fully blue water, so it can interdict shipping to and from China nearly anywhere. Japan's Navy has the range to reach the Persian Gulf, where most of this crude comes from. But what Japan cannot do is reach the Gulf if the path is hostile, and that is where India comes in. Not only can India reach the Gulf by itself now, India can interdict anyone attempting to approach the Gulf from the east. So that's the third big point. No one in East Asia can access the Persian Gulf without India's express sign-off. India is the most important country in determining whether China will survive the next few decades. It's entirely up to you. And this all might be happening sooner than you think. First of all, we are likely to have an energy crisis in the next few months. Now, you may remember back during the Obama administration, the Americans and the Iranians cut a deal where Iran would cancel its nuclear program if in exchange it was rehabilitated. There were a lot of Americans who thought that deal was bad. Trump was one of them. And Donald Trump canceled the deal and applied a maximum pressure campaign to destroy the Iranian economy, which has been broadly successful. Now, under the new president, Biden, the talk is whether or not that deal is going to be revised. It's not, because the circumstances have changed. The Iranians are kind of over a barrel right now, and the Americans, if there is going to be a new deal, they want a much stricter one that restricts Iranian policies. To that end, the Iranians realize they don't have anything to trade, so they've gone out to try to establish new chits. So around New Year's, they started hijacking ships in the Gulf, specifically a South Korean chemicals tanker, thinking that that would get the Americans' attention. It didn't. Trump did nothing. Biden did nothing. We don't care. Because of the shale revolution, we don't care about global energy markets. So expect the Iranians to kind of up the ante and grab bigger and bigger ships in order to get people's attention. That obviously has consequences for energy shipments. Second, the Americans have had a sharp falling out with the Russians over everything from cyber crime to cyber stalking to election interference to general propaganda. But because the Americans don't care about energy anymore, the Americans are preparing a series of sanctions against Russian energy exports. So now all of a sudden we have a potential for an energy crisis both in the Persian Gulf and in the former Soviet space. And losing trans-Suez shipments this week has certainly not helped. This can all blow up very quickly, and the Americans are not going to be a guarantor of energy shipments. If anything, they're going to interfere with them. Then we've got American-Chinese relations. On his way out the door, Donald Trump rolled a couple of grenades into the bilateral relationship. called what was going on in Xinjiang a genocide, because, it is. And he said that any American political leader, any American bureaucrat can visit Taiwan in their official capacity as an American representative. That's about that far from formal recognition. On his first day in office, President Biden reaffirmed both policies. In addition, he sent 2 aircraft carriers into the South China Sea to do military exercises within sight of the Chinese military bases there. We have new policies on Hong Kong. We have new policies on Tibet. The Biden administration has doubled down on all of the sanctions and tariffs that the Trump administration administered to China, including those on Huawei and CNOOC. And the Americans' new trade representative, Catherine Tai, that's the woman in the top left, she's Taiwanese. The Chinese perceive this as a full court press against their interests, and they are not wrong. On the Chinese side of the equation, they realize that their demography is sharply terminal. They realize that their export-led economic model is in danger. And so they are closing ranks, demonizing outsiders, and hunkering down for an economic breakdown. Choose your measure. Demographics, trade, military reach, geographic exposure, finance, energy. The dragon is not only a myth, it's a dying one. And what does this all mean for the elephant? Opportunity. Now that doesn't mean there aren't challenges ahead, and one of them is going to hit now. There are 3 new strains of coronavirus that matter. The first one out of the United Kingdom is more communicable. It is probably already the dominant strain in both India and the United States. The second one out of South Africa is cross-species transmissible with rodents, which means it will never go away. We now know for certain that we will all need boosters forever. The third one, the Brazilian variant, bypasses pre-existing naturally gained immunity. Now, luckily, all the vaccines that we know of so far in the West work against all of the variants, and all of the Western vaccine manufacturers are already working on phase 3 studies for boosters, which will all be ready by this October. So for the Americans, this is a relatively minor issue. But every American who gets a booster shot is someone else in the rest of the world who can't get a core shot. So this is something that is now the new normal. Even worse, for any country who pursued a herd immunity strategy, whether on purpose or accidentally, that includes Sweden and Brazil and India, you now need to do it all over again until you can achieve mass vaccination complete with a booster schedule. Which brings us to the fourth and final takeaway. Globally, we aren't even halfway through with coronavirus. Okay, that's a lot to absorb. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that there are a few questions that people want to throw my general direction.
Peter, fantastic. I think I will throw some of those questions. I'm sure all of them want to know this. 2 or 3 very important points. Why would the US leave? Why would it dismantle an infrastructure? Yeah, I mean, you had a reason to put it up, 40 years back, 50 years back, up to 30 years back, you said. But now that it's in place, it's an infrastructure, it's an asset that you've got. Why would you leave?
Well, let me start with the logical and the scientific and the economic. I agree. I don't think the US should leave. I think that the United States needs to retool the global order for the new age. I personally would love to see the United States lead a new alliance that is committed to human rights and laissez-faire capitalism and a general, being nice to each other sort of feel. But people who feel the way I did have lost the last 8 presidential elections. And in this most recent one, we didn't even have a candidate in the race. The globalist view in the United States is functionally gone. And the competition politically in my country is between a number of sides, all of whom think that the United States is either overextended or is there for the wrong reason, or that it can't be done in the first place. President Obama chose to just retreat from everything. President Trump chose to take a sledgehammer to whatever was left. And President Biden's not America First. President Biden's Buy America program is actually the most nationalist economic policy that my country has had since the Great Depression. We're done. We're out.
Yeah, I hear you. That is a political requirement, and surely that will be weighing on people's minds when they sort of plan for their elections. I'm only saying that since there is an infrastructure which is already in place, I mean, why would they just give it up? Or would they probably contract it to people, as partners?
Well, the whole idea of the global order is we pay people to Europe.
Just one more thing is, what about the defense industry? I mean, will they allow this backtracking?
The American defense industry doesn't have nearly the political clout that a lot of people think it does. And honestly, the United States is perfectly capable of turning isolationist and maintaining the defense industry in its current form. When you decide to back away from the world and you reduce all those bases, you need longer reach military capability. That doesn't come cheap, and that is something that both Democrats and Republicans in the United States agree is worth the investment. So you can stand back and have standoff distance and still not be involved in the day-to-day of what's going on in the Eastern Hemisphere. As to the sunk costs, when you have an economy the size of the United States and you never invested your economy in the physical infrastructure that is necessary to maintain the global system, then there's no economic loss when you back away from it. And that's exactly what we're doing. So yes, diplomatically, strategically, it seems like a waste of effort. I agree, but most Americans don't. And it's very easy for the United States to cut its defense ties and still maintain de facto control over the entire Western Hemisphere. And remember, the United States has 11 aircraft carrier battle groups and the rest of the world have none. So the United States retains the capacity to inject itself into any situation anywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere and then sail away from the next day. So that is involvement, but it's not involvement with the goal of stability. It's involvement with the goal of instability.
Yeah, but with an understanding then that there will be regional hegemons who will come in, and they could be sort of disruptive to the American order also.
Yes, that will happen, but that will take time. Right now, all of the major powers are addicted, for lack of a better phrase, to American involvement, and so everyone is going to have a significant downgrade in their capacity. The countries that are likely to rise up in the future, the one that I'm most concerned about in terms of maybe clashing with American interests is Japan. But if there's any country in the world that has a full understanding of what it means to clash with the Americans, it's Japan. So there's plenty of room there for things to go right rather than wrong. The other countries that are likely to rise up and become regional hegemons include France and Turkey, but honestly, there's not a lot of interest that we're gonna have clashes. And the strategic space that something like this provides for a country like India is immense. It's just a question of what India decides to do with it.
You didn't mention Russia at all.
I did not. Russia's demographics are among the world's worst. And if you throw in things like heroin addiction and HIV and alcoholism, Russia is looking at complete cultural collapse over the course of the next generation. That doesn't mean it won't go out swinging. And if I bordered Russia, I would be very, very worried. But Russia is not long for this world.
Okay. You said something, today and in our earlier discussion, that India will probably be in a very strong position to safeguard the Middle East and the oil supplies to the Eastern Hemisphere, and being from where we are, it looks good for us. But what about the Pakistan and the so-called CEPC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? I mean, isn't that a land route which will be used by China?
First things first, I wouldn't use the word safeguard for the Middle East. That is definitely a business you do not want to get into. That is no fun at all. I would use the word arbitrate. You decide what goes and what doesn't, because you control the sea lanes. As for the Chinese-Pakistani axis, I fully realize why that's an obsession in India, but let me kind of underline something here. If we ever get to the point where the Chinese are capable of projecting power through that corridor into Pakistan, two things go wrong for the Chinese very, very quickly. Number one, they are treated to the same tender mercies that the Americans were when we tried to transit Pakistan. That's no fun. And number two, let's assume for the moment that the Pakistanis and the Chinese can sing kumbaya and all get along and they can pacify the Northwest Territories and all that good stuff. You do a half a dozen bombing runs into that gorge and that entire transport network collapses in an hour. So you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese investment to stabilize it. You cause a few landslides and it's done. That is not a stable transit system.
Okay. Now, you know, we've spoken about the Quad mechanism. US, Japan, Australia, India alliance. It's not really an alliance yet, but will it become a nation, NATO? 3 out of these 4 players are highly developed, rich nations. India stands out in contrast. Will such an alliance of disparates work beyond the common interest of just checking a surging China?
I don't think it'll ever be a military alliance in the traditional sense, because that requires a military player that is willing to act as coordinator, and the Americans are not really interested in that role. The American goal with the Quad is to get the other 3 countries collaborating where is feasible. I think that's going to make it more of a political alliance than a military one, because of the 3 countries, Japan's the only one with an expeditionary military. The Australians definitely punch above their weight, but this is a country of 30 million people. They can only do so much. India is the country that has the most strategic flexibility and has the best strategic position. You don't need a blue water navy in order to secure everything that you need for your future. And because those 3 countries have such wildly different defense capabilities and needs, talking with one another is great. And that's probably all you need. But the idea that one of you can come to the military aid of the other 2, I think is a reach. That doesn't make this pointless, but it does definitely limit how far it can go.
Okay. So I want to just read out of Peter's resume, his biodata, which I didn't start off with. A little bit of it, because my question will start from there. Peter is a critically acclaimed author of The Accidental Superpower and The Absent Superpower, and his 3rd and latest title is Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World, which became available in March 2020. And what actually interested me and drew me to talk to him, to invite him to this conclave, was this one para. With a keen eye towards what will drive tomorrow's headlines, his irreverent approach transforms topics that are normally dense and heavy into accessible, relevant takeaways for audiences of all types. With a keen eye toward what will drive tomorrow's headlines, his irreverent approach transforms topics that are normally dense and heavy into accessible, relevant takeaways for audiences of all types. This, to me, sounded very similar to what we at Times Network stand for. Irreverent, trying to look at tomorrow's headlines, basically. And that's the reason, and I also follow him, his blogs, very interesting, very contrarian. But one thing really stood out, and that is really the reason, in fact, I told him, the reason that I wanted him to come to talk here was that such a person does not really talk about India at all till recently. In fact, I really searched for something for him on India, and I found something which was a little, not very complimentary to us. And therefore, I gave him a little time to apply his theories and his numbers and his analysis and his intelligence to, study India, so that we get the benefit of his, his analysis and make a little more sense of what we need to do. And I hope that this also will interest him in doing some more work on India even after India Economic Conclave. So let me go with the question. Our conclave theme is, this is India's decade, 2021 to 2030. We want to know your remarks on how you see India performing in the decade ahead on the global stage, your view. Can you, from your vantage points, see and tell us 3 advantages that India can leverage this decade?
Let me start by saying that it's not India's decade. It's a lot more than a decade. And it's not a global stage. The global stage will be gone. So the idea of becoming a major global power is kind of irrelevant. India needs to focus on its region. because I believe one of the previous speakers mentioned that 70% of global trade crosses through the Indian Ocean Basin. It only crosses through the Indian Ocean Basin if India allows it to. So you remove the Americans from the equation. Instead of having a single global stage, you have a lot of regional stages with limited interaction. India faces no major security threats. In fact, it has the capacity of choosing who to elevate and who to crush. Anyone who wants to get through, anyone who wants to get Persian Gulf crude, anyone who wants to be involved in European, East Asian trade, India is the only country that can allow that to happen. And to think that India can't take advantage of that is silly. So strategic positioning, honestly, it doesn't get much better than where you are. Second big advantage, most of the world is facing complete demographic collapse. India is one of only 6 countries with any level of development that is not. There are challenges within that, but not having to completely rewire the way your society and economy works because of the changes in the global system, changes that you can't affect, that's wonderful. And there's only, you can count it on one hand the number of countries that are in that situation, and none of them are nearly as powerful as India is. And then third, you are one of about a dozen countries in the world that will not be facing an energy crisis. Because anyone who wants to get crude out of the Persian Gulf has to go through you. And it will be very easy for you to either get your own energy or to basically charge protection money for anyone who decides that they want to still use Persian Gulf crude. You're looking at maybe 20 countries in the world with a reasonably positive demography, and only 12 that can keep the lights on without help. And you're in both categories. I mean, honestly, you can't generate these sort of advantages with policy. This is just kind of luck of where you physically happen to be.
Thanks, that's nice to hear. Now, India was, you said, India was never deeply integrated into the global economy till a few years ago. And you pointed out as a short-term opportunity in a regionalizing world. How can, however, such a disengaged player emerge to be successful within the global economy in the long term? And that too,
there's not going to be a global economy, so I wouldn't aim for that. It's like, India is a major economy in and of itself. Most of the resources that it needs are either from the subcontinent itself or from Southeast Asia and Australia. Those connections are fine. The point here is that the rest of the world, everyone that India has always compared itself to, they're the ones that are facing the challenge because they're the ones who are having the rug pulled out from under them. That doesn't affect India. So in relative terms, they fall, India rises, and in absolute terms, India can continue growing. The biggest challenge that India is going to have for the next decade is getting used to a capital structure that is much more similar to the situation you had in the 1970s and the 1980s than what we've had in the 2010s. India knows how to operate with that. It won't be fun. Having half the capital at 4 times the cost is going to hurt. But you're still going to have a better capital structure than the countries that are dependent upon importing it from the wider world, while also dealing with mass demographic collapse.
Okay. Now, the world's leading market, US, is going to depend more on NAFTA. Your blogs say that you're going to be much more integrated with Mexico over the next few decades. And the world itself is moving to low labor-intensive manufacturing. And we, however, are a nation of, at best, semi-skilled at the larger population level. So over the short and medium term, with a financial crunch that you're talking about, how's the next 4 or 5 years, 10 years maybe, going to be for India? Is it going to be any better than now?
Let me adjust the strategic side of the question there before getting to India. Is the United States, is NAFTA moving into a less labor-intensive system? Yes. But remember, as we break apart the world and the globalized system fails, what makes sense in one region will not necessarily make sense in another. So you can have North America going into a system that uses 3D printing and just-in-time manufacturing and shorter supply chains, while what's going on in Europe goes a completely different direction. We're going to be seeing that sort of breakdown and as barriers, security barriers rise between the various regions. So for India, you don't necessarily have to go that way to supply your own needs, especially if you do a little bit of integration with, say, Southeast Asia. Second, India is not a normal country. It's not a traditional nation state in the Westphalian sense. It's more like a loose association of different cultural regions, more like the Holy Roman Empire, if you will, which means that within India, there is substantial opportunity for parts of India that are at different stages of development to develop a kind of mini globalized system of manufacturing, with one part doing the higher end, one part doing the lower end, lots of integration, kind of like what the Americans do with Mexico. It's a model that works with the system you have, where you already have high-skilled and low-skilled manufacturing in the same country. Remember, this is a country of 1.5 billion people. There's a lot of variety, not just culturally, but economically. The biggest challenge India will face into taking advantage of that and operationalizing it as a manufacturing model is infrastructure. Again, it's a problem India knows, but if you can link those regions together with better road and rail, you can solve a lot of the problems that you're identifying here right at home.
Okay, thanks. I have 2 more questions before, if there is any questions that I can take from the crowd here. Meher? One is probably a simple one, but you said that the boomers population is going to suddenly go off in 2022, which means global, capital markets are going to suddenly change, flip over in 2022. Now, and last year, we've also had a huge bull run. Indian stock markets have outperformed in the last 1 year since the strictest lockdown. It's mainly due to the liquidity glut. How long will this party last? And I know your answer, but what would you advise Indian investors in that context? And what else are the investment avenues for people today? Because, people are having a party here right now.
Absolutely, yeah. No, let me start by saying I am not a financial analyst, so take this for what it is. But yes, I expect that a lot of the positions that the baby boomers in the developed world have, yes, a lot of the baby boomer positions in the developed world are going to be liquidated, especially those that are in the developing world, and India is no exception there. So you should expect a significant pullback of foreign investment of all types from India over the course of the next year to 2 years. That is kind of baked into the situation right now. That will not be fun. But for domestic investors, so long as capital flows are unimpeded, and I think once we have a big pullback, capital controls are going to go up in large portions of the world, India included. But as long as those are not there, investing in the American market, if you're just looking for returns, is kind of a go-to. It's generally considered the lowest risk. And so we're already seeing money pour into the United States, despite the fact that we're engaging in deficit spending that is just atrocious in historical terms. But moving forward, as the foreign money dries up, the Indian economy, the Indian municipalities are going to have no choice but to issue their own debt in order to compensate for the lack of investment that comes in. So there'll be ample opportunities to invest in local infrastructure. And honestly, if you're the Indian federal government, that's exactly where you need it to go. That is, in my opinion, the single biggest challenge facing the Indian system. Because as the global system cracks apart, India is going to be more dependent on what it can do at home. And anything that improves connectivity throughout the subcontinent is something that is going to serve India for decades.
So that would mean real estate?
I'm sorry?
Would that mean real estate? I'm talking of as an investment avenue for Indians.
I think I'm getting out of my depth here when it comes to real estate in India. Sorry.
So I have one last question. Do you think India may actually stand to gain from a collaborative relationship with China? You've spoken of their expected precipitous demographic slide. Can India use Chinese capital and open the Indian market to them and get to a win-win relationship with our neighbor? Hypothetically, will such a collaboration be viewed with caution by the US and the West?
I don't think the United States is going to be too worried about that. We're coming to the conclusion in the United States that the Chinese story really is overblown. That's starting to kind of seep into the edges of American consciousness. It's certainly the dominant strain driving the Chinese right now. So there is one part where I don't want to I don't think I'd use the word collaboration, but where India can certainly take advantage. Capital flight from China is already at epic levels, in excess of $1 trillion US a year. So you've got Chinese citizens who realize that their situation is on the edge and they're looking to put their money anywhere else. India is as good of a location for that as any, if there are sufficient investment vehicles to be used. And there's any number of methods that India could use to take advantage of that. State of California, United States is kind of the gold standard in how to attract Chinese capital flight, for example. But in terms of broader cooperation, every country that has tried that, it's gone badly. The Chinese bring in their own workers to do the infrastructure. The Chinese do it with their own money, or they charge loans, and then you get left with something you might not necessarily need on the back end. Every state that has participated in the Belt and Road Initiative has, in the end, ultimately repudiated the debts. And the Chinese idea of a joint venture is, how about you pay for everything and we take all your technology? If India can break the mold and make that relationship work, India would be the first country to do so. So honestly, I would focus your energies elsewhere.
We at least convinced them to take on a religion for a long time. With that, I think I'll open it to the audience for some questions, if any. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Mihir here from Times Network. Your ideas are great, and we have spoken before. What I want to ask you is, in Indian media, we often refer to China as a dragon, and India is referred to as elephant. Between two of them, what is real and what is a myth?
I feel like I covered some of that in the presentation. Chinese success today is honestly just a manifestation of a moment in time. The Americans changed the rules by how the world worked, and that allowed China, which had never really been unified, to suddenly burst forth upon the global stage, because for the first time, it didn't have to worry about resources or market access or capital access or its physical security. And if you remove those four concerns, it's really hard to not succeed, which means that all it takes is the Americans leaving to pull the plug on this whole thing. And that's exactly what's happening. Right. But India chose to not participate in that system. For the time of the Chinese rise, 1980 to 2015, that hurt India. But now that the Americans are leaving, everything that India has remains intact. All your problems remain intact, but they're problems you know. It's not like the strategic environment for you is changing in a way that penalizes you.
Right. I have a follow-up to that. You have a basic assumption that India will remain a democracy and China will always remain under a communist rule. How confident are you about those assumptions?
I'm not sure I have that assumption. The default status for Chinese government is dictatorial. That takes the form of the Communist Party right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the same form. And if the Chinese Communist Party proves unable of maintaining China's economic position, I have no doubt that the Chinese people will consume it. That doesn't mean that what replaces it will be any better for anyone. Chinese history is very long and very, very, very dark. I am not confident of the next chapter of Chinese politics being better than what they have now. And to a certain degree, the same goes for India. India is not a unitary system, it's federal. And one of the things that has held India back is that the local and the state authorities have just as much power as the national authorities, and sometimes it's hard to get things done. But that also suggests that democracy in some form comes innately to India in a way that it doesn't to most parts of the world, because you're already used to a fairly strict separation of powers. Now, under the current government, things are getting a little punchy when it comes to democracy. There's no doubting that. But I don't see any version of how this evolves that can kind of rein in the regions in any meaningful way. So at a worst case scenario from a democratic point of view, your federalism is fully intact and will survive this. The question is the degree to which you allow traditional democracy to exist within the federal network. And that is a political question that can only be answered at the local level. You can't just have someone at the top by fiat wipe out how you guys manage politics locally. You have far too long of a tradition, stretching back centuries, for that to happen.
Thanks. I'll take one last question.
Yeah, Peter, thank you very much for giving a great perspective on opportunities and strength India has. And opportunity which I can sum up is first opportunity and strength, you said that we have demographic dividend, which is more than 60% of population is below 30. The second advantage you identified is the location advantage, nobody can take it away. And third advantage which you narrated is that India somehow was not part of that global alliance which happened between 1945 to 2020, let's say. My question is, what are the threats? Because nobody can take away my location advantage, and the global alliance is the past. Can somebody attack my democratic dividend by drugs, by something else? Can you throw some light on this threat to our democratic dividend? People can attack us.
Sure. So pros and cons. Well, actually, this one's a pro and a con. You are urbanizing, which means that birth rates are dropping. And instead of having a pure pyramid, you're now like kind of hollowing out at the bottom a little bit. In the midterm, and by midterm, I mean like 20 years, that's a net plus, because every rupee that you save on not having to care for a child, you can put into higher education and high-powered consumption. In many ways, that's the Chinese story from 1995 to 2015. They had a lot of young adults, but very few children. So those young adults consume just as much as parents would, but instead of spending it on diapers, they spend it on condos. That generates a lot more high-octane growth. India is approaching that moment at the end of this decade, and then it will last for 15 to 30 years based on what happens down below. So your demographic dividend in a certain way is actually about to get a lot more powerful economically. Now, if you do what China does, something like one child, and you never regenerate your population base, then 50 years from now, you're screwed. There's a lot of time between now and 2070 for your demographics to round out. So that's a long-term concern, but something you should be aware of. As to things that can actually damage your demographic dividend, drugs won't do it. Honestly, you're a big enough country that a war couldn't do it. And since you're not dependent on international trade for your food supplies or even the supply chains to supply your food supplies, that won't do it. The only concern that I have for taking advantage of your demographic dividend is gender relations. Half your population lives at a lower political level, for lack of a better phrase. I'm trying to be delicate about this. And as long as that is the situation, you're only generating the economic activity of half of what you could do. So if you can make that cultural jump in a more isolated world, your future is very bright. But you need to mobilize your entire society to do that. India has regional cleavages. That's part of the problem, but it's nothing compared to the situation that you face with gender relations. If you can make your women feel safe and feel like they are right there at the top and making decisions, you will have explosive economic growth and make India a better place at the same time.
Thanks, that's a fantastic point. I have but I think I've run out of time. Do I have some time? Yeah?
Unless they say no, I say keep going.
No, yeah. Yeah, so there's a question that's come in. The Suez Canal block, if it prolongs, what happens to trade? And
this is turning into a really big deal, isn't it? I know it's only been 3 days, but 1/3 of the canal is not navigable. So that photo we all see of it's kind of jammed into the side, that's the deep side. So not only is the bow wedged in on the deep side, the stern is wedged in on the shallow side. And there's not a lot of precedent for this, but there was a similar ship in terms of weight and bearing that ran adrift in Panama a few years ago. It ultimately took 6 months to get that thing moved. They had to physically remove all of the containers first, most of which were at first by helicopter, and then they had to build a causeway up to the deck so that the cranes could get it in. Let's assume for the moment that that's the situation from here. Well, that's a freaking disaster. I mean, you're talking here about the majority of cargo trade between Europe and Asia, and you're talking about 10% of global energy trade, because most of the ships that are using the canal use the canal because they have to use the canal. They don't have the range to go around Africa. And even if they did, that doubles transit times. So you are talking about an event all by itself that can cause a global recession. Now, we probably won't notice that in the numbers because of coronavirus, and we're already in a global recession. But you want to talk about something that kind of kick everything to another gear. In addition, and this is something that is people really haven't started to register yet, if you have a lot of ships in the Red Sea full of cargo, pirate heaven. So I mean, this is one of those things that if the Americans don't step in, and we're not going to, this could end globalization in everyone's mind in like 2 months. In addition, you're going to have significant pressure in energy markets. I mean, a 10% disruption, that can easily generate a doubling in prices. But that's doubling of prices on average. Since India is on the other side of the Gulf, or on the other side of the Suez Canal, India would be facing an energy glut. So you can have energy prices triple in Europe while you actually get a discount in New Delhi. It's kind of a win-win for you guys.
Great. The other one is a question on the Russia-China equation. What do you think about it?
The Russians and the Chinese are allies of convenience. Remember that they have fought a war in the last century, and they don't like each other very much. The Chinese perceive the Russians as backwards. The Russians see Chinese efforts to colonize southeastern Siberia as an attack on their country, which it kind of is. And the relationship only is useful for the Chinese in 2 ways. Number one, it's an alternate support. Try that sentence again. It's an alternate supply of oil and natural gas that is not dependent on the Malacca Strait, American protection, Indian cooperation, or the Persian Gulf. So anything that can be piped in from Russia is a definite plus. Second, military technology transfers. Until the Chinese become sufficiently technically apt to be able to copy everything that the Russians have, the Chinese still have a need to continually import military products from the Russians. But make no mistake, very few of these products are getting fielded. They're not doing mass purchases. They're buying like the floor model. They take them home. They try to reverse engineer them. And anything that they can make, they do. And anything that they can't, they then order another one. That's basically what it is. And the Russians are absolutely getting their shirts, or absolutely getting gutted in terms of their trade relation for China. That's one of the reasons I'm so pessimistic on the existence of Russia over the long run, is that their anti-Americanism has completely blinded them ideologically to the fact that their foreign policy is actually hollowing them out in an industrial and a technological sense. China is absolutely getting the better advantage of that. And if we ever get to the point where the Chinese can copy everything that they've taken, then the relationship basically loses almost all of its meaning. So aside from some diplomatic collaboration, for example, in the UN Security Council, there really isn't much to that relationship there. They really do not respect one another, and they certainly don't trust one another.
Thanks a lot, and that is really, really illuminating. I think we've had a wonderful session, Peter. Thank you very much, and I hope you will continue to sort of have some more interest in India, and I would hope to see more blogs about this region going forward. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.
In the world that we're moving to, India's relative position is going to skyrocket, so I don't really have much of a choice in that.
That's nice to hear. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you.